if you look at how South African companies operate across the supply chain, what would you say our proficiencies are and our weaknesses are?
Okay, there are many plus sides in South Africa and Africa generally. I think you picked up the resilience of Africa in terms of the way that it's trying to move forward in the future. I think from a CIPS perspective and our experiences working in South Africa, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, is that within organisations themselves, there's different tiers of proficiency. So in fact you have very proficient, if you like, senior management within procurement that are really driving forward change in probably what we would call the upstream as opposed to the downstream sort of supply chain. So really starting to become more focused around what is the need of the country, what is the need of organisations in terms of production going forward. I think one of the main challenges, again, from an experience of CIPS, is that in South Africa, in fact, Africa in generally, there is a high capability in some areas, but actually the capacity, the number of people engaged in procurement and supply chain is actually quite low, particularly skilled people in that respect. So I think there's a requirement for stronger vertical integration within the supply chain.
What about the inefficiencies? Because things may be working well from an organizational point of view, but you can't guarantee that the port facilities will be working well, the roads will be working well, the planes in the last week weren't working well, and all those things start to act as constraints. And do we have enough contingency measures or strategies of overcoming difficulties, do you think?
Well, it's quite interesting because last week was our conference. CIPS Southern Africa launched itself, and our own supply chain let us down. We couldn't get our speakers here from the UK, so very small example, but I think everybody everywhere was hit by the volcanic ash situation. I think probably taking the localization agenda in South Africa, it shows the importance of developing that agenda to enable all of that infrastructure, I think, in that respect. But the key issue is infrastructure, in South Africa you can see is doing a huge amount to cope with that, but larger Africa does need to do more, I think, around developing its infrastructure. It's you talked about ports, deep water ports, for instance, to enable the greater ease of reliance on, I suppose, other forms of transport rather than just air in that situation.
There's also a call for support of small to medium local enterprises, and within that there's lots of talk of enterprise resource planning, getting the technical inputs right.
It's quite interesting, really. Within for small medium enterprises, one of the big issues is experience of resource planning, and all of the resource planning systems are probably not affordable for many small medium enterprise organisations. So therefore it poses them a number of difficulties from experience and from a resource perspective, and therefore from a planning perspective I think they struggle then to be able to see the resource requirements, particularly of large organisations, and understand what the long-term impact of their commitment to that relationship is in the future.
You spoke about procurement in your opening statement, and I think that's very important because even Rob Davies, in unveiling his new industrial policy plan for South Africa, has emphasised the need to create localised industries around mainstream industry, and the ambition to create 2 million jobs in the next 10 years. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, a good example of a policy within South Africa is the Department of Public Enterprises Competitive Supplier Development Programme, and you know that they work with the state-owned enterprises such as Transnet, Eskom, SAA Airlines. Now what they're doing through competitive supplier development is encouraging that localisation, encouraging production. So if you take, for instance, the example of Transnet and the train manufacturing of trains, an obvious solution for organisations like Transnet, which they're pursuing, is actually perhaps whilst they're having the trains manufactured externally, maybe outside of South Africa, it's linking up that supply chain within South Africa, component parts being manufactured here, ease of access, not stalling 6 or 7 weeks or longer, waiting for train parts to come internationally. So if you can build the supply chain inwardly on that
Right.
basis, it's going to make a huge difference to the economy here.
Chris, just building on the analogy that Karen has just used about the trains, we've seen the aeronautic and military defence industry in Scandinavia stimulating the growth of the automotive industry in that part of the world. Can we transplant those models in Africa? Can we learn lessons from what's happened in those countries?
I think you can. I mean, if you take a country like, an area like Scandinavia, they don't have any natural resources to really to speak of. They're in the northern part of Europe, the weather's not wonderful, and yet they still manage to do exactly what you're talking about. Whereas down here, we're endowed with so many natural advantages. And one industry that springs to mind immediately is solar power. For example, solar-powered geysers. We're way behind the curve, and yet we should be right in front of the curve. We're now going to be bringing in terms of some of these plans that I've seen, solar heaters from Brazil. The plan is over time to get local production up to a much greater extent of these type of things. And that's just one example, using particularly good advantages that we have locally.
Just a simple question. We were always told that the manufacturing competency of this economy is weak, especially when we're competing against the Asians. So as we talk about localized production, are there enough suppliers of some of these industrial inputs that we can create these industries, localized industries alongside mainstream?
No, there are not. And that comes back to what you were talking about earlier, the integrated nature of this whole thing. You've got to have an integrated system, education, creating skills, and that takes time. You don't do that overnight. That takes 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's where the Scandinavians have had a huge advantage, because they did that long ago.
Yeah.
Karen, just a final input from you on this one. Skills and training, what can we do better?
Obviously, we're the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, so one of the things about CIPS is that we're already very actively engaged in Africa. We've got nearly 13,500 members, typically around 700 in Ghana, 4,000 in Zambia, and we're already working very hard to develop people, to develop skills from the base level right through to the strategic level. We've also been involved in developing unit standards that will benefit the country, working with National Treasury, working with the Federation of Supply Chain Management Association to try and enhance not just the skills, but giving the foundation of those skills the infrastructure to support them within the country.